Thanks so much for having us here. I think this is actually a very important issue. So far in this conversation, we haven't had a lot of specific examples about what the Occupy movement actually is doing. And I think that this is part of the problem, and actually is part of the problem both that leads to the kind of structural antagonisms reproducing or reappearing themselves in the movement, but also with the conversations we're having. So here's one really specific example. All right, in New York over the past 2 months, there have been 15 families, all people of color, that were living and homeless on the streets, that were displaced because of the Occupy movement being in the park, and actually moved into foreclosed homes by people there. All right, this is a specific attempt in this movement to address a very specific constituency. Now, what does this point out to us? Well, one, that there are some efforts that are being made, even if the focus of the movement writ large hasn't been on this particular question, to address this, which means that there has to be at least a minimal level of consciousness that the intersection of race and class is important. Okay. Second big framing issue that I think is important. In 2010, there was a study that was done, and it said, how much wealth do the 1% of the world actually have? $28.9 trillion. That's more than the economy and GDP of the United States times 2 on an annual basis. That's 450 people, basically, that control that much wealth. Which means that if you want to talk about responsibility, the people who are involved in keeping economic stratification are the people that are in Wall Street, okay? And that stratification, as the cross-examination just revealed in part, feeds into or takes a role and a part in other systems of oppression, in particular those that affect people who are of color. Okay, my opponent has essentially made 4 arguments. The first concerns the definition of sufficiency. I want to put on another word in the resolution that we used. That's potentially, all right? You cannot hold the affirmative responsible for the way that the movement looks now, and here's why. It's a dramatic shift. As my partner brought up, on May 31st, there was no movement. September 17th, this movement takes form. Where it is now, with all different cities, addressing different kinds of issues, with differing degrees of violence being directed at this movement, it is a wildly different one. And it can go further and into different places. It has the ability to grow. It does have the ability to have some conversation. It has demonstrated that through these changes and shifts. So what does that show us? Well, it shows us that we can potentially get something out of this, that there can be alterations, modulations, changes within the movement. So, sufficient. Yeah, sufficient, and in the future can be enhanced. All right, colorblindness. Huge objection. There's no denying that the intersection of race and class is a particular conundrum for this politics, and there's no denying that this movement, in many ways, emerges, I think, out of a middle class that is predominantly white, that expected a certain kind of reward on its education, and because of the situation with the economy, has not had the traditional kind of expectations worked out for it. That doesn't necessarily mean that it, however, operates in totally colorblind fashion. So they read this piece of evidence from Professor Joel Olson. He actually came to our department about 3 weeks ago and had a conversation about Occupy because he wrote a small pamphlet that they're reading from. And his argument is actually we should embrace the Occupy movement despite its colorblindness because there's an opportunity to get something out of it, okay? It's a strategic use of the ability to be with other people who are at that point in time trying to politicize issues that affect us all, even if they affect us in very different ways. And in specific, historically, politicizing something, getting it into a public eye, shifting politicians to move further towards major positions that would help a lot of people who are in the 99%, even if those situations are different, is extremely or extraordinarily rare. And so if the movement has an impact on politicizing these issues, it can be pulled and tugged in other directions that are unexpected. They also say that this will cause us to somehow turn a blind eye as if we've fixed the problem. No, Occupy movement's premise is that conversation is important, okay? And if that conversation is important, it has to continue, because the truth of the matter is, 5 years ago, wealth was almost as unequal as it is now. In the 1970s, wealth was somewhat less unequal than it is now, which means that there's no magical policy that's going to come up and fix this overnight. This is going to have to be a sustained, agonizing conversation, and there's going to be difficulties with it, but it has to be affirmed and pressed forward. Okay, so the second thing that they say is that there's a lack of concrete action. The leaderless movement is kind of uniquely a way of dispossessing certain people. The problem is, I think that this is sometimes true and sometimes not true. It depends on the sensitivity of the people involved. And it is way too generalizing to make a claim that every instance of conversation is counterproductive or reproduces the exact same dynamics of racism.
So,
You're with three.
what do you think the sort of idealization of Wall Street would look like? So, if you take sort of the most committed or sort of original Wall Street protesters and you sort of magically gave them positions in Congress,
that would never happen, so why are we envisioning that scenario?
Well, it seems like to sort of get a feel for Wall Street's goals, what do you think they would do or policies they would endorse to remedy what they're talking about?
I think there are two problems with the orientation of your question. One, the movement, while it has been directed against the 99%, does have a lot of disparate concerns. So there are a lot of different voices advocating for different things, okay? So I'm not sure you could just say, what does the ideal movement look like?
Okay.
Second, if you want to agree on a single agenda item concerning wealth inequality, they're probably at root advocating for massive redistributions of wealth globally.
Okay.
The call in...
So
Sorry,
at its root, whilst the movement is really one focused almost exclusively on wealth inequalities and sort of can't really agree on necessarily a social platform.
I just said, first, there are a lot of different constituencies that are involved in this conversation. They haven't been as inviting and as open as they could be. Yeah, they are probably narcissistic at some level, but different kinds of narcissism are open to other people in different kinds of ways. And the point of the conversation is that sometimes you can get something out of that.
Sure.
And that it's not just for everyone that's there about one thing. And if there are people who think that in the movement, they should probably be more open. That's our advocacy. That's what we'll defend potentially means.
Sure. Why is it that sort of racial participation, or why is it that a sort of race-focused politics should be allied to the Occupy Wall Street movement and maybe shouldn't happen outside of it or sort of parallel to it?
Why can't it be both? Why can't there both be one that's allied to it and one that's outside of it?
Sure. Well, it seems like we've presented a lot of arguments as to why, if it's allied within the Occupy movement, that would sort of silence a lot of the potential for it to articulate.
So then you've got a group outside of it that keeps those issues really live when the group inside of it forgets about them, and they exist in a healthy tension with one another and have a conversation that is better overall.
Sure, but it seems like in your answer to that question, you're sort of conceding that there isn't really, that Occupy not only is not a good vehicle for articulating these particular demands, but isn't one that can really articulate them at all or has any space for...
I don't have to... You're being way too generalizing with the statements that you're making, all right? Occupy can talk about these things, and it has become an issue in some of the cities that has become, brought to the forefront. When my friend Casey went up, the conversation was predominantly about the intersection of race and class. It's the reason why they dealt with the dispossession of the people who were homeless in the park in order to move them back into foreclosed issues, was because, look, we didn't think about this. We need to address it in a tangible, local-based effort in that particular example. My point is it's too broad to make the kind of claims you're making.